In 1865, the Great Plains were engulfed in war due to the expansion of the United States, which threatened the dominance of the Lakota. The American conquest led to bloody battles and the eventual defeat of the Lakota. The Great Plains have always been a place of conflict and a source of inspiration for myths and legends, drawing the attention of artists and storytellers. The struggle of the Lakota stands out, but they were not the first inhabitants of the plains. Their ancestors, the Teton, came from the eastern forests and were part of the Oceti-Sakowin, or Sioux Confederation. In the early 16th century, migrations divided the Sioux Confederation. Some bands split off, forming the Nakota or Stoney and Assiniboine, who became rivals of the Southern Sioux. The arrival of the Ojibwe, an Algonquian-speaking people from the Great Lakes, in the 17th century also had an impact. They pushed the Sioux onto the plains, forcing them to adapt to their new environment. The Teton Sioux, facing the threat of the Ojibwe and dwindling resources in the forests, moved to the Great Plains. The Tetons' diet began to rely heavily on hunting buffalo, which were plentiful in the region. The buffalo, known as tatanka in the Lakota language, became crucial for the survival of the plains people. By the 1730s, despite hardships, the Lakota thrived on the plains. The arrival of the horse transformed their lives, making it easier to adapt to the plains and helping them successfully settle in the region. Introduced by indigenous traders from the south, horses quickly spread across the west, transforming buffalo hunting and the nature of warfare. They allowed hunters to become warriors, and horse stealing became an important rite of passage among the youth, demonstrating bravery. The horse became central to Lakota warfare, and their warriors, armed with bows, spears, and war clubs, gained a feared reputation in the West. However, Lakota expansion led them into lands claimed by other nations. Expansion to the north was impossible due to the Iron Confederation and the Blackfoot Confederation. To the south, the Lakota clashed with the Cheyenne over the Black Hills, a territory contested since the 15th century. Through devastating attacks and the influence of European pandemics on the Cheyenne, the Lakota managed to expel the Cheyenne in 1776 and claim the Black Hills, becoming one of the most powerful nations in the West. However, in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase significantly expanded U.S. territory, ushering in a period of expansion that threatened Lakota dominance. The first contact with Americans occurred in 1804, when Lewis and Clark entered Lakota territory. The reception was initially cordial but quickly turned into mutual hostility. The Lakota viewed the Americans as ignorant and belligerent, while Clark described them negatively, marking the beginning of a tense and conflict-ridden relationship. The United States wanted to grow, and the Lakota were in the way. During the 19th century, the United States began expanding its territory westward at the expense of Spain and Britain. American migrants, hoping to find a better life in Oregon, began traveling through the heart of Lakota territory, killing buffalo in large numbers. Conflicts between settlers and the Lakota became frequent. In 1845, the U.S. government sent troops to intimidate the Lakota into leaving the wagons alone. Lakota warriors like Red Cloud were unimpressed by this show of force. If the Americans wanted a fight, many Lakota were ready to face them. However, the Americans could not afford a war on the plains, as they went to war with Mexico in 1846. After 2 years, they achieved a triumphant victory, claiming California and the Southwest as spoils of war. With their southern flank secured, the Americans redistributed troops to the west and began interfering in local affairs. In 1851, the U.S. government attempted to create fixed boundaries for the indigenous nations and avoid wars that threatened their immigrants. They called influential leaders from various nations to a council at Fort Laramie. The Lakota, represented by Oglala Chief Conquering Bear, were among the attendees. The Americans would be allowed to build roads and forts on their lands in exchange for money and goods. But Conquering Bear did not speak for all the Lakota. Almost immediately, other leaders broke the treaty by resuming attacks on the Arikara, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. With their diplomatic proposals rejected, the Americans decided to assert their authority over the West by force. They found the pretext in a dispute between Mormon settlers and the Lakota over the death of a stray cow. The cow's owner complained to the garrison at Fort Laramie, and Conquering Bear offered one of his own horses as compensation, but the Americans were not satisfied. The next day, 30 soldiers marched to the Lakota camp and demanded the man who had killed the cow. When Conquering Bear refused, the Americans opened fire and killed him. Such conflicts were common during the settlement process. The battle became known as the Grattan Massacre. Outraged by the deaths of their soldiers, many Americans called for revenge against the Lakota. On September 3, 1855, the U.S. Army massacred a Lakota community at Blue Water Creek, killing more than 80 men, women, and children. The brutality of the U.S. Army shocked the Lakota leaders, leading them to declare a ceasefire. However, any dream of peaceful coexistence was dead. Though they made peace with the Lakota, the Americans faced renewed resistance to their Western ambitions. Between 1860 and 1864, American soldiers and settlers went to war with the Shoshone, Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. While superior firepower gave the Americans a distinct advantage, they were stretching their resources thin by 1863. The situation worsened when the Americans began building the Bozeman Trail through Lakota hunting grounds. Within a year, thousands of gold miners were following this route to Montana, facing constant battles with the Lakota. The Lakota set aside their differences with the Cheyenne and Arapaho to form a united front against the Americans. On July 26, 1865, 3,000 Allied warriors attacked the United States garrison at Platte Bridge and cut off the Bozeman Trail. The United States government responded by sending 2,500 soldiers to reopen the route, but Lakota warriors, led by Red Cloud, avoided direct confrontations, opting for attacks on convoys and ambushes. This guerrilla strategy was devastating. The attacks culminated in a fierce battle on the outskirts of Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming. A wagon train leaving the fort was attacked, and Captain William Fetterman led 81 men on a rescue mission. They were lured into an ambush led by Crazy Horse, where 1,000 Lakota and Allied warriors awaited them. Within 20 minutes, all the American soldiers were killed. Red Cloud sent a clear message to Washington: respect our territory or face a war to the death. In 1868, the Americans finally listened and signed a treaty at Fort Laramie, recognizing Lakota claims to the Great Sioux Reservation. However, 10 years later, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills led the Americans to violate the treaty and march west, reigniting the conflict. The Lakota, who had migrated to the Great Plains as invaders driven from their former lands, transformed into powerful warriors. When American settlers arrived, the Lakota led a coalition of former enemies to defend their territory, which they had shared since the early 16th century. The mass migration and resulting conflicts shaped the history of North America, with indigenous peoples already in motion long before the arrival of Europeans. In the early 16th century, the Iroquois of the St. Lawrence River faced threats from the Algonquins and Mohawks, leading to the disappearance of the Iroquois in the region. The arrival of Europeans, such as Jacques Cartier, and French traders, further complicated the conflicts. The French and British formed alliances with indigenous tribes for fur trade and colonization, respectively, leading to battles until the mid-18th century. The 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, was a turning point, with the French defeat and rising tensions between the British and indigenous peoples. The Proclamation of 1763 attempted to limit colonial expansion, but American settlers continued to encroach on indigenous lands. In 1776, American independence forced indigenous nations to choose sides in the war. After the rebels' defeat, the Mohawks were exiled, and the Western Confederacy of 1783, led by Chief Thayendanegea, was defeated in 1795. In 1811, Shawnee Chief Tecumseh formed a new confederation, leading to the War of 1812, where Canadians and indigenous allies resisted the American invasion. After the war, the United States expanded westward, resulting in intense conflicts with indigenous peoples like the Lakota, who resisted until 1868. The discovery of gold broke promises to the Lakota, resulting in renewed war and the end of resistance on the Great Plains. The gold rush also affected peoples like the Nez Perce, who, despite adopting the American way of life, were forced to fight and eventually surrendered in 1877. These migrations and struggles of indigenous peoples left a lasting legacy in North American history. While millions of people crossed oceans in search of a new life on the continent, indigenous epic journeys became a thing of the past, just as the rush for wealth and land attracted European and American settlers. The violent frontiers that once divided civilizations became peaceful borders between nation-states. But even today, we follow in the footsteps of our ancestors. From the mouth of the St. Lawrence River to the shores of the Pacific, the legacy of these great migrations endures in the people who call North America home.